We're pleased to have James Maroney here this evening. James is a longtime friend of the Athenaeum, and I'll introduce him formally in just a minute. First, I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, I'm usually remiss in this. I'm Bob Jolly, Athenaeum Director. Welcome to the Athenaeum. We have sponsors for this program. This event, this Vermont Humanities Council program, doesn't happen without the support of local sponsors and statewide sponsors and a whole variety of people. It takes a village, so to speak. What makes it happen here in the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum is two sources, Adler and McCabe. Steve Adler is often here. Is he here? Well, thank you, Steve Adler and Daniel C. McCabe of Adler and McCabe. They make this happen here, and the Friends of the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum make this program happen. They are our library sponsors, and I want to give them a round of applause. Tonight's talk by James Maroney is underwritten by Passumpsic Savings Bank. They are longtime supporters of the Humanities Council, of the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum, of every, I'm going to keep my hands to myself, every good institution in the area. So thank you, Passumpsic Savings Bank. Statewide, this program is sponsored by National Life Group Foundation and a grant from the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, administered by the Department of Libraries. In the case of the IMLS, your tax dollars at work. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a good thing. So thanks to them. And for the first time this year, the St. Johnsbury Academy is underwriting the statewide portion of this program at the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. So as I said, it takes a village to make these things happen. So to all the sponsors, thank you very much. I think that's part one. Part two is briefer. A couple of upcoming events. There are flyers on most of your seats. I put some chairs out late, so I didn't put flyers on there. But the next First Wednesday event on December 2nd will be the literary achievements of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales with Dartmouth professor Peter Travis. So there are flyers on your seats, or there are flyers on the table right outside here. And under the Haste Makes Waste department, some of you may have gotten our electronic newsletter, and in it, it said, on November 11th, we're having a public forum here to talk about library matters, mainly responses to our survey. Had I looked at the calendar with any attention at all, I would have understood that the History and Heritage Center is having a band concert that evening, and Mavis Staples and Joan Osborne are performing locally. So out of the three, Library Matters, Mavis Staples, you see where I'm going. Disregard our attempt to hold a public forum on Wednesday, November 11th. On Wednesday, December 9th, and we will be publicizing this widely, we are going to have a public forum here. And we have copies of our paper survey. They're here. They're on the table in the foyer here, and we're really interested in your feedback. What matters to you matters to us. We really want to know. That's what makes programs come together. That's what makes the collection something you want to use, the space, etc. So feel free to fill out a paper survey, drop it off anonymously, not anonymously. If you really want us to get back to you, sign your name, but completely anonymous. We're happy to get your feedback. So on Wednesday, December 9th, we will have a public forum, which will be announced. I've looked around right now. Joan Osborne is not coming back. Mavis Staples is going to be gone. That's good. To our speaker, James Maroney. James Maroney is an independent art dealer, organic dairy farmer, and farm advocate living in Vermont. He is the past head of American paintings at both Christie's and Sotheby's, New York, and received his MA in art history from Columbia University and an MBA from the University of Massachusetts. He started his career at Sotheby's in 1967, where he became head of American Paintings and was that from 1970 to 1974. He opened his own private gallery, James Maroney Incorporated, in 1977, selling fine American paintings to museums and private collectors. In 1986, James moved with his wife to Vermont from New York City, buying Oliver Hill Farm in Leicester and transforming, literally overnight, from art dealer to dairy farmer milking 125 cows on Saturday. Today, he continues to run James Maroney Incorporated and has been appointed by the Secretary of Agriculture and the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation to Vermont's Agricultural Working Group. And James has been around the Athenaeum for a long time, and he always has a very erect bearing. And today, I did my little sleuthing online, and I read his CV. And James is also an ex-Marine, hence his upright bearing. Please welcome James Maroney.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to move this out here because I speak rather loudly. Can you hear me all right in the back? Is this all right? Yeah. All right. If you can't, just please raise your hand. Give me a hint. So tonight I'm going to talk about George O'Keeffe. I hope that my pictures, I've made them as big as I can, and hope that you can see them. I'll try to get through this and hold your questions, I think, toward the end, and then I'll try to deal with questions as they come up. I don't know what I can do about that. There, I could do that. Isn't that something? There we go. All right. So let's go. So George O'Keeffe was raised on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. She studied art in high school and came, when still a teenager, to New York to study at the Art Students League. She made herself a household name in American modernism, but in midlife took herself out of the mainstream to live in seclusion in the desert of New Mexico. Most people think first of her flowers, but her work encompasses other subject categories: abstractions, pure landscapes, still lives, skulls and bones, and buildings. In 1902, O'Keeffe's father moved the family to Williamsburg, Virginia. She stayed in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin for a year, but eventually joined the family and enrolled at Chatham Episcopal School, where she studied art with Elizabeth May Willis. In her senior year, she served as editor of the school's yearbook. The prevailing art style in those days was Art Nouveau, whose most famous practitioner was Alphonse Mucha from Czechoslovakia. The hallmarks of the style, as you can see here, were beautiful young women dressed in classical robes, surrounded by garlands of flowers. Lines were long, smooth, and undulating, or organic. Colors were earthy and soft. O'Keeffe's life was later to become intimately involved with Alfred Stiglitz's, about more in a moment. But now it is important to note that in 1902, Stiglitz launched Camera Notes, the journal of the Camera Club of New York. At just this moment in O'Keeffe's life and career, Stiglitz was to become a champion of American modernism. Note, however, the Art Nouveau decoration on the cover of the 1902 brochure. I'm pointing out the Art Nouveau characteristics because modernism was a dramatic shift away from Art Nouveau, and I hope you'll see that in a minute. After graduating from Chatham Episcopal in 1905, now just 18 years old, O'Keeffe enrolled at the School of the Art at the Art Institute of Chicago. 2 years later, she enrolled at the Art Students League in New York City to study under William Merritt Chase. Chase was a master of his time, and while he did not work in the Art Nouveau tradition, no one ever accused him either of being a modernist. O'Keeffe received the prestigious Chase Award scholarship, which allowed her to study at Amatola, the school's Lake George summer school. She also studied under Arthur Wesley Dow, who was the head of the art department at Columbia Teachers College in New York, where O'Keeffe enrolled in 1912. Dow taught harmonious design and abstract design, and while he was obviously a colorist, as you see here, he was not, in our eyes today, a modernist either. This is modernism par excellence. In 1911, Stiglitz mounted an exhibition at his gallery in 291 Fifth Avenue of proto-cubist works by Max Weber, who was America's most far-out modernist. The following year, at his gallery 291 Fifth in New York, Stiglitz exhibited works by Arthur Dove. We can plainly see that saturated color and abstract shapes were in, and Art Nouveau and representation were on their way out. At about this time, O'Keeffe left New York to take a job teaching art in the public school at Amarillo, Texas, where she stayed for 2 years. In 1913, the International Exhibition of Modern Art, which is also referred to as the Armory Show, set the whole American art world on its ear. It is hard to imagine today the effect on the public of seeing art like that shown here on the left for the first time. Imagine the two worlds illustrated in the photos shown here colliding. O'Keeffe was in New York on occasion during this time and certainly visited both 291 and the Armory Show, but she continued to paint in the Art Nouveau style for another 3 years. In 1915, O'Keeffe sent these are two of several charcoal drawings to Stiglitz, who was sufficiently impressed that he organized a one-person show for her at 291 without O'Keeffe's permission. The curious thing is, of course, that Stiglitz, who was now a full-blown modernist, these drawings are informed by an Art Nouveau sensibility. All of these, I hope you can see that, these sort of smooth, undulating, organic lines. Tent Door of 1913 is also composed of soft lines, but it is decidedly modernist in feeling. So O'Keeffe is about to make this transition. Stiglitz included O'Keeffe's Blue Lines in a group show at 291 in 1916, alongside works by Marston Hartley, Arthur Dove, John Maron, Stanton McDonald Wright, and Waldo Frank. These names are among the most prominent American modernists at the time. Her transition to modernism is pretty much complete. O'Keeffe used abstraction to record her expressions taken in the vast Texas panhandle. This is one of her great landscapes. You can see here that O'Keeffe had settled on what was to become her touchstone, a single subject reduced to its essences, abstract in feeling, yet still representational, palette limited to 2 or at most 3 saturated colors. This one is called Light on the Evening Star. Thank you. We might not know exactly what this picture is without knowing its title, and that it is a work by O'Keeffe. But with this information, we see that she has painted a single subject, reduced to its essences, abstract in feeling, yet still representational, palette limited to 2 colors. One can imagine that she worked on a picture like this for less than 2 minutes. Nowhere in this form is this formula better demonstrated than her several impressions of the Rancho Church. She made numerous pictures of this church. Most of them look just like that. In 1918, Stiglitz began a series of photographs. Stiglitz was a photographer. He began a series of photographs of O'Keeffe in the nude. That same year, Stiglitz separated from his wife and moved in with O'Keeffe. In 1924, Stiglitz's wife divorced him. Increasingly aware that the nude photos were fueling salacious controversy about her and her work, O'Keeffe put a stop to the nudes. Some men asked Stiglitz if he could do photos like them of their wives and lovers. O'Keeffe was amused, and she responded that if these men had known the nature of the relationship between Stiglitz and O'Keeffe that made these photos possible, they might not have been so interested. Stiglitz did over 300 portraits of O'Keeffe, of which only about 45 are in the nude. But he also photographed other women in the nude, both probably lovers, Dorothy Norman and Rebecca Strand. In gray lines with black, blue, and yellow, O'Keeffe departs somewhat from her formula, but she reveals her origins, her affinity for organic shapes and fluid lines. She also begins to zoom in on her subjects in an effort to help herself and us focus on their essential characteristics. This sensibility would be the beginning of her infatuation with flowers, almost always recognizable as species, but sometimes not, as here. Without question, O'Keeffe's most popular subjects are her flowers. As if that assertion needed substantiation, this one, a fine example and a good size, brought 45 million at Sotheby's about a year ago. O'Keeffe reduces this flower to its pure essentials, making a picture that relies on only the object's lines and color. I mean, it's not terribly difficult to make flowers into a popular subject, but O'Keeffe's focusing in on the pictures very tight and then making the canvases quite large, I think was helped. But I mean, who could not like a picture like this? Some of the observers have seen female sexual imagery in her flowers, but she denied this all her life. O'Keeffe used this somewhat aggressive red and yellow palette far more often than most people realized. She painted flowers in it and landscapes, bones, that's a pelvis bone floating in a yellow sky, and shells. Here is a good place to switch gears and look at how O'Keeffe took her formula into landscapes. The structural simplicity of this subject belies its conceptual complexity. The sunrise is again reduced to its essences, yet the concept is recognizable. The colors, limited to three, are saturated, and the effect is beguiling. Here are two typical landscapes she did of the New Mexico desert around Abiquiu, where she lived. We see at once that she is using the formula she established back in about 1916, from which she rarely deviated. Here's an instance of what happens when she did. This picture belonged to Frank Lloyd Wright, who hung it in his office at Taliesin West, which he built in 1937 near Scottsdale. At 40 by 48 inches, it is a huge picture, but it has three not really saturated colors, blue, ochre, and white, and it has four subjects: moon, sky, mesa, and pelvis. It should work, but somehow it is just too busy. I had a personal experience with this picture. I had a client who told me he owned a little company called Humana. He was a very wealthy man. And he said he wanted to buy a great O'Keeffe. And I showed him this one. And he said, "Oh my God." He said, "That looks terrific. When can we go?" And so on next week or whenever it was, I met him at Teterboro Airport out in New Jersey. We got on his little jet and off we flew to Scottsdale. It was just him and me in this little plane. And we got there and we drove over to Taliesin West. At Taliesin West, Frank Lloyd Wright was a tall man. At Taliesin West, we went in the door, and for some strange reason, the ceilings were sort of at 5'11". And my client struck his head on a sharp angle sticking out and bloodied his head. He took his handkerchief out, he's like swearing, and he's blotting his head. I'm thinking, oh, this is not going to work out very nicely. And then the director greeted us and took us into the back where his office was, and he showed us this picture, which was hanging on the far wall without a light on it, slightly at an angle, and my client said, "Let's go." Well, another 5 hours back to New York. So I've never liked this picture. I hope that in years to come, O'Keeffe's skulls will become a more important part of her legacy than her flowers. She only did a dozen, all between 1931 and 1944. These subjects appear to be, like her flowers and her landscapes, not so much of her making as of her serendipitous discovery. She would walk out into the desert and she would find a skull or a set of antlers or something like that. And I imagine she just held it up against the sky, and of course the sky was gorgeous. And then she would bring it home and maybe prop it up on something or other and paint it against the sky. And this is a unique formulation, a subject matter for her. No one else had ever done this before. And they became very popular. They were a little morbid. And so some people who prefer pretty flowers to dead skulls maybe didn't take them quite as rapidly. But to me, they are her one of two of her most important subjects. And you'll see a few more here. This one is in the Metropolitan Museum. These things are lying discarded at her feet. She raises them up and contrasts them against the sky, almost always with the hills or the mesa in the distance. And she makes beauty from what nature has no further use of. No discussion about objects discarded by their previous owners and turned into beautiful art would be complete without showing one of her clamshells, probably her rarest of subject motifs. She, again, moves us in close, as with her flowers, and she limits her palette to shades of black and white, just a hint of crimson. Some observers see in these little compositions an obsession with the spermatozoon, but of course, she denied this for the entirety of her life. Here she focuses on the interior of the shell, and sees a landscape in it. Again, we would not know what this object is without knowing O'Keeffe's title, and that she painted it. The Shelton Hotel went up in 1922 on 49th Street and Lexington Avenue, the first skyscraper to be built after New York City passed its first of the nation's zoning laws in 1916. New Yorkers were keen to limit construction of skyscrapers because they blocked the sun. The buildings had therefore to be designed to step back as they rose, assuring that light and air would reach the street. In 1924, Stiglitz, 60 years old, and O'Keeffe, 36, were married. In 1925, O'Keeffe and Stiglitz took a little two-room apartment on the 36th floor, where they remained for 11 years. It is impossible today to convey that for people, the vast majority of whom had yet to fly on an airplane, what it was like to be so very far up in the sky. O'Keeffe painted the Shelton from the ground as it reflected the sun, maybe in response to all the fuss about shadows. But she must have looked at it through Stiglitz's camera, which would have given her these wonderful spots. Her first sortie into this new subject was far more quotidian. This building, which does not get into the title and does not even have a name, shares the picture space with 3 or 4 of its neighbors: a steeple, a traffic light, a street lamp, and a moon partly hidden by scudding clouds. While it too was painted from street level, it does not project the sense of verticality or grandeur that is the vital ingredient in her other buildings. We notice in all 3 pictures the clouds, the steam, and the smoke rising from the street are wavy, as on the right over there, which is a residual interest in her Art Nouveau sensibility. You cannot make it out in this slide, I don't think, no. But the red light on the left, that rectangle of red, is actually emblazoned with Stiglitz's name. This picture I also have a personal association with. This picture, which is called City Night, 1926, I believe. Is that what it says? I was in an exhibition at the Whitney Museum in New York in about 1982, I guess it was, and it said underneath it, collection of the artist. And I thought, my God, how could that be possible so many years later that this fabulous picture still belongs to O'Keeffe? And so I got in touch with her. Her helper, Juan Hamilton, was an acquaintance of mine. And I asked him, is this possible that this picture belongs? Yes, he said it does. And I said, well, cutting to the chase, I said, you know, would she sell that by any chance? And he said, oh, yes, she might. And so we talked a little bit about it. And then I got on a plane and I went out to visit her. And I bought the picture. And I kept it for about 5 or 6 years, kind of under the bed, because I paid her. O'Keeffe was no fool. I mean, she knew very well what it was worth, and so she charged me that plus a little more. And I still consider myself lucky, and there's an old expression that one shouldn't confuse a rising market with brains, but I knew the market was going up. And so I bought the picture, and sure enough, about 5 years later, I pulled it out and offered it to a great friend of mine who was then the director of the Minneapolis Art Institute, where they had no O'Keeffe. And I said, well, what about this one? And he said, my God. And he said, could it be? And I said, well, yes. And he said, well, send it right out. And so I sent it out, and he called me back after about I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks, whatever it was. These things don't happen overnight. And one of the things that a museum has to do before they acquire a picture, they send it to conservation to make sure that it's in good condition. Well, I did the same thing. When I bought it, I sent it to my conservator to make sure it was in good condition, and he assured me, yes, it was fine. So I bought the picture. So Sam calls me up and he says, about the O'Keeffe, he says, I have good news and bad news. And believe me, in the art world, there's no bad news you want to hear. But I said, well, let's start with the good news. And he said, the committee has okayed the acquisition of the picture. I said, that's terrific. I'm thinking, what could be bad after that? And he said, the picture is 50% new, overpainted. And I said, what? Now, I should just tell you, as pictures get old, things happen to them. I mean, the paint cracks or other things happen, and so conservators will fix them very often by very carefully painting in the cracks. But no conservator would ever take a roller and repaint all of the black on this picture. Is, you know, everything on this picture which is black was brand new. And so I said, well, can I just call you back in a little while? I quickly called Juan Hamilton and I said to him, is this true? He said, yes. And I said, you never told me this. He said, you never asked. And so it turns out that black, for a conservator, and there is a conservator here in the audience, so I hope I'm going to get this right, black is what's known as a fugitive color. If you were to take a rag of some solvent, say, and swipe it across the painting, the black would come off first. And somebody had taken a rag to clean this picture and wiped the black off just enough to expose the high parts of the canvas all over it. And so when that had been discovered, they reported back to O'Keeffe, and she said, well, it's not a problem. Give it to my conservator, he'll fix it. And the way he fixed it was to repaint it. And he did this with her approval, theoretically. I mean, she's still alive, and she did send it to this restorer, and he did follow her instructions. So here I am with an original O'Keeffe, which is 50% by this man called Felrath Hines. So the bad news was that the Minneapolis Museum approved the purchase, but they wanted it for half. And so I like this picture, but that was an interesting lesson. So that was my experience with City Night. I love this picture. I wish it were all there. This slide here I just put in. I'm wondering why I put that in right now. Just one second. Oh yes, I put that in because I also do a slideshow on Grant Wood, and that picture was by Grant Wood. And so maybe someday the Vermont Humanities Council will have me back to do that. So that concludes my remarks on Georgia O'Keeffe. Are there any questions? And maybe you want to bring the lights up, Bob, or? Pardon me?
Did you sell the paint?
Which painting? Oh, yes, I did. You mean the City Night? Yes, because what was I going to do with it? I mean, the condition of a picture is an extremely important factor these days more than ever. And so most collectors, the Minneapolis Art Institute understood what had happened to the picture. And if it had been, I mean, it was not irresponsibly conserved. It was perhaps irresponsibly treated the first time when the black came off. But if you could go through almost any museum in the country with ultraviolet glasses on and see the condition of the pictures, you would be horrified. Many pictures that are 300, 400, 500 years old, they're not all there. I mean, that's almost universally true. And of course, the way to restore them is, as I said before, it's very, very discreetly, and you want to do as little touching as possible. And so that was rather an unusual circumstance. So did I see a hand come up over here?
It was the same question.
Sorry?
Same question.
Oh, same question. Yes. Anybody else? surely. Yes.
So are you saying when you go to an art museum and you see a picture of something that's 100 years old, several hundred years old, we're actually seeing retouched work that we're not seeing the original?
The purpose of conservation is to make the picture appear as it did when it was original. Now, all kind of things happen to pictures. Little Johnny gets out his scissors and cuts them. They fall off the wall. They're damaged in transit. They get heated. The paint dries too fast. All kinds of things happen. And the older the paintings are, the greater the chances are that they have suffered one or all of these problems. So when you go to a museum, you are looking at what is original and what has been changed, and the conservator's job is to make it, you shouldn't know that. Now, in sculpture, these days, conservators have taken, so supposing that this arm is missing, it's just gone, and it's a Roman figure. They might put the arm back on the figure if the arm was doing something important, but they would make it brown or something, not white, so that it doesn't, so that you can see what is original and what isn't. 35, 40 years ago, they would have done the same thing. They would have made the arm out of plaster or made it look like alabaster or something. And some pretty funny things can happen when conservators who come with an idea of what the lost part might look like, but no real knowledge, when they have to, use their imagination. Some pretty funny things can happen. Yes?
Can you say anything else about Georgia O'Keeffe as a person, other than her prowess as a shrewd negotiator?
That's a really good question. O'Keeffe grew up very much in a man's world, and she was a tough cookie, although she had a very, very gentle demeanor. I mean, maybe I should say she had a very gentle demeanor, but she was nobody's fool. And she lived to be 98 years old, so she'd seen, she'd been around. Although she did, after her relationship with Stiglitz kind of crashed, she moved, and then Stiglitz died, she moved to Abiquiu, where she lived pretty much alone. She spoke and wrote in very simple sentences. It was disarming. If you read her letters, she had a very big, bold handwriting, and she very often would go out. This, by the way, is not by O'Keeffe. It's by Charles Demuth, excuse me. She would go out into the desert and she would find a subject that she wanted to paint, and then people would say to her, well, can you describe that? And she would say, well, I went out into the desert and there was this bone and I painted it. And you could either go, wow, far out, and a lot of ink has been spilled, I think, trying to expound upon what O'Keeffe chose not to expound upon. I mean, she really did speak in very clipped, very short sentences. I remember I went to Abiquiu on 3 or 4 occasions, and on one occasion, by the way, she only wore black from head to foot every day, black, and she was only about this high, and I went in to greet her in her studio, and I was wearing a kind of a fore and aft cap made of wool. It looked a little bit like a navy hat, but it was a wool, I don't know, something I bought in London and I liked, and it was black. And I walked in, I put my hand out to shake her hand. Instead of taking my hand, she took my hat. And she pulled it down on her head, and she just sort of smiled. And I loved that hat. But I couldn't take it back, and she wore it all during lunch, and she wore it as she waved me goodbye. So she was inscrutable. She definitely had an eye for her own persona. She cultivated her persona. if she were here, she would object to that. She would say, no, this is who I am. But whenever anybody tried to go and see her, she would put up obstacles in their way, and then you would insist some more, and then finally she would find a date for you months out or something like that. And so by the time people got to Abiquiu to actually get in her presence, they were enthralled already by the anticipation. And her photograph as a nude woman, was pretty amazing. So she made a lot of herself as a sexual persona, and as a recluse, and as a romantic. And of course, her flowers and so forth all sort of fed into that. She also made absolutely sure that her paintings were well represented in all of America's cosmopolitan museums. She started by giving, when Stiglitz died, he had a wonderful collection of painters like Demuth here and Marsden Hartley, and a few others from the modernist group, because Stiglitz had been their dealer, and pardon me, and O'Keeffe gave these to the National Gallery, and of course the National Gallery was thrilled. And so now other museums who are thinking, oh my God, we don't have an O'Keeffe, or we better get one, and so they would ring up and try to get, and if it was a good enough museum, like the Art Institute of Chicago or the Metropolitan Museum or the Boston Museum, she would somehow make it happen, that 5 or 6 of her pictures, her best pictures, would go there. She wouldn't sell pictures to just anybody. Money wasn't good enough. If you pulled up in her drive and said you were a wealthy Texan and you wanted to buy a picture, she would say, no, I'm not letting you have one. Well, she let me have one, didn't she? But she didn't tell me about that little problem. So I hope that gives you a sense of who she was. Yes?
There was an exhibit of George O'Keeffe's, I think it was in San Francisco, was it last year? And it featured all of her Lake George paintings.
Yeah.
And all barns and
Yeah.
beautiful autumnal images of leaves
Yeah.
up close too.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if you could comment on that. Did she ever make it across to Vermont? Did she, do you know that body of work?
A happy period of her life. Stiglitz was married when they took up together, and her family, or Stiglitz's family rather, did not approve. And she was 30 years his junior. He was an old man. And I guess they could see what it was in her that he liked. But they probably made it unappealing for her to be there. They had ways of. And so one can look at her Lake George pictures and see gloom. Not overt, but not the happiest time of her life either. So I'm not saying that they're not great pictures. I mean, many of the, as you say, the barns.
Yeah.
Yeah. But whether she was trying in those pictures to express this gloom or to hide it is a little unclear to me. But they're not joyful, brilliantly colored flowers. I think the happiest years of her life were in the 20s when she did those buildings. And Stiglitz had just discovered her and brought her up from Amarillo, Texas, to the big time. I mean, and so and Life magazine and so on and so forth were after her. So those things were working well for her. That Stiglitz died in 43, 4, right in there. And when she moved to Abiquiu, I mean, she became inward. The curious thing is most painters have a trajectory of success, and many of them start off strong, and by the time they're 25, 30, whatever it is, they're doing great work, and many of them then kind of just go down like that. And they don't ever have the spark again. O'Keeffe, I can't draw that line for O'Keeffe because her latest work is the same. She just kept recycling her subjects, not her buildings or not her skulls, but she kept doing flowers and landscapes and many little still lifes and things like that. And somehow or other she found new energy that she put into those pictures. And she did quite a lot of pure abstractions. And we didn't really get into those, but she did. I think there was one, that light on the plains. When I say pure abstraction, I mean you don't recognize the subject at all. It could just be lines. She did a couple of those. And there have been exhibitions. I mean, O'Keeffe is one of the most critically acclaimed and researched artists of the American first half of the 20th century in America. I mean, she has been thoroughly analyzed. And she did 2,000 pictures in a long career. If I were going to do an exhibition of her work and I had the freedom to keep it limited to what I thought were her best works, only her best works, it would probably come in at under 50. And that sounds like a condemnation, but I've seen a lot of O'Keeffe works, and many, many more of them have no inner flame. You can kind of tell that after a while. I mean, like she got up on a Wednesday morning and she thought, oh God, I guess I better paint. And she did. And it didn't necessarily, the ingredients for a great picture were simply not present for her at that moment. Now that might have gone on for a day or a week or a month or a year or a couple of years, don't know. Most artists, and most of us, I think, in our work, if we look critically at the things we've done in our lives, as I said, most of us, our best work maybe is when we're young. I know some artists, like Mars and Hartley, for example, or at Stuart Davis, did great work when they were young. Then they had a really bad period in the middle of their life and found something again at the end of their life. So there's kind of a bimodal sort of thing. O'Keeffe was not bimodal. She just came up. She got rid of her Art Nouveau stuff quickly enough that you will never see it, except in this presentation. I mean, almost every exhibition of O'Keeffe's work begin well after those first pictures because they don't fit into the narrative, and that's not what people come to see. They come to see the flowers, for the most part. And I'm going to guess, don't know this exactly, that the flowers probably are 65% of her work. I appraised her estate when she died in 1998. I think she died in 99. I did her estate. Now, this was not pictures that I didn't do all 2,000 pictures because most of them were already sold. But she still owned, I don't know, 300 pictures. Some of them she'd owned for a long time. That for some reason or another, she just didn't sell. Okay, another? Yes?
What did become of her estate, her home estate?
Oh, well, the estate still, well, there's a museum in Santa Fe devoted to her life, and the woman who started that museum, a woman from Fort Worth, Anne Marion is her name, she made an arrangement with the estate. So Anne went out and bought a lot of O'Keeffe's that were on the market, and then the estate also exhibits things there, and so I'm almost certain that the rest of it is there. And they might sell a picture now and again, maybe to raise money, but Anne didn't need to raise money. Her father started a little company called Tandy, so she had plenty of money. And so the O'Keeffe Museum is okay, but by the time she died, all the great pictures, most of the great pictures were gone. And curiously enough, that Jimson weed that I showed you was sold by the O'Keeffe Museum. Go figure. I mean, they must have decided they needed money, but I mean, wow. I mean, I don't know how you can call yourself the O'Keeffe Museum and sell that picture. That was an odd thing. I didn't ever ask her why she did that. So, yes, sir.
Any idea what Juan is up to?
You know, the last time Juan lives in Hawaii, I think, and he became a sculptor in his own right. And he was quite fed up with being George O'Keeffe's secretary. He used a different word. And he went there, I think, as a young man to help her. He was responding to an ad in the paper, I guess, for somebody who could arrange some artist's affairs, something like that, and found himself being an assistant to Miss O'Keeffe. I think he was there 30 years or something. This is a lot. And I think that it began to be troublesome for him. So he and his pots moved to Hawaii, and I haven't heard from him in many years, many years. Yes?
When O'Keeffe was asked about symbolism in her art, what would she have said?
She would have said there's no symbolism in my art. What you see is what you get. I mean, and I think there are very few pictures by O'Keeffe that reek of symbolism. I mean, it's hard, I think. Let me see, just a second. Hold on. It really is hard not to see female sexual imagery in this picture. But she wasn't cute about this, and she must have been asked 500 times. She didn't say, well, you know, or anything like that. She would just say, this is a flower. This is a black iris. Okay? So reductivist would have been the right word for the way she spoke and described herself and her art. A few words, and it fits in a funny way. I mean, who doesn't see that this is a black iris? And so what more do you need to know? If you read her letters, I mean, her letters sound like the letters of a child writing home from camp. And she wrote them as a grown woman. So, yes? Yes, sir.
As an art historian, is it unique for an artist to make the transition that she made from something so, or maybe not? Art Nouveau was so organic and stylized, and then in one lifetime she's doing this very abstract stuff.
I don't think that's at all unique. I think that's quite common, and I think we are the product of our time, of course, we don't necessarily know it. She did not know modernism was in her future. I mean, when she was an 18 or 20-year-old at the Art Students League, she was under the influence of William Eyre Chase and Wesley Dow and her teachers, and of course everybody around her was painting in this same way, and everybody across the world was painting in that way. Now, where the roots of American modernism are exactly is unknown. At the Armory show, many of the American modernists were in the Armory show, but they didn't look like Duchamp, that nude descending the stairs. They didn't look like Picasso. They didn't look like Leger. They certainly didn't look like Kandinsky. Now, Max Weber was probably the most cutting-edge modernist in America in 1912 when he painted that picture called, I think it was called New York. O'Keeffe apparently didn't look at that and said, oh my God, I want to do that. But the transition she made in 5-6 years, and yet when she goes to paint the steam or smoke coming out of the radiator building in 1926 or so, that's the way she chose to paint it. And I mean, if she were here, would I ask her if that was coming out of her Art Nouveau roots? I don't think I would say that. I mean, she would,
But she did choose the motif of flowers for,
yeah.
just the 85%.
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody else, I mean, flowers is a curiosity that flowers were considered woman's art in the 19th century. And since she was born in the 19th century, that would have been, she never, as a young woman, would have tackled the subjects of what the big boys were doing. I don't think she would have, as a 19, 20-year-old. The fact that she made flowers her life's work, I'm going to say that could have, it had roots in her being a woman. I'm okay with that. I'm not saying that other people couldn't have painted this picture, but they didn't. I mean, there isn't another, I can't think. Joseph Stella painted a lot of flowers, about the same, in the teens, but he also painted a lot of other things. They're not to be confused. I mean, they're two different things. So, but the fact that she painted them so realistically. Abstract flowers, very few, very few. Yes?
Did she come in contact with any of the Mexican muralists like Rivera or Orozco?
Yeah, she would have certainly known of them. I've never really thought of her in the same sentence with them. She certainly, I could tell you now, just as I think of it, there was no social realism coming out of her. She was not somebody that would have taken on a subject like that, like Diego Rivera. If she had thoughts about working people or the unfairness of what it meant to be a worker or everything, she didn't put it in her paintings.
Where that thought came from was the molding and shaping of the forms that she used made me think of some of the ways in which the human forms, the muscles on the men that are in the murals that you see.
You're seeing a similarity in their line, in their forms? Form. Yeah. It's a very interesting observation. I don't see it, and I certainly don't see the content. I don't see any social protest in her work. Whether she shared an aesthetic appreciation or something like that with Diego Rivera, I mean, she certainly would have known about the huge mural that Diego Rivera painted for Radio City, for the Rockefeller Center rather, that Nelson Rockefeller destroyed. She certainly would have known about that. But if she was angered by that or something, it certainly didn't appear in her pictures. Stiglitz would have been more inclined to be out to say something about that. Yes, sorry.
Just comparing Rivera with his calla lilies that he's...
I'm sorry, a little louder.
To compare with Rivera, to continue that subject.
Yeah.
His calla lilies, though, do you see any comparison to that?
Did Rivera do calla lilies?
He did.
He did. Well, a lot of people did calla lilies. This is not I'm not ducking. Yeah, in 1923, 4, 5, calla lilies had some kind of fascination for a lot of artists, and a lot of them did them, and then they stopped. And O'Keeffe certainly did calla lilies, big ones. Now, she then now comes up, the calla lily has that big yellow, and so the questions about male genitalia come back up, and so on and so forth. Then, whether that tired her or not, I don't know, but Charles Sheeler did calla lilies. Demuth certainly did calla lilies. Marsden Hartley did calla lilies, on and on. I don't think I've ever seen Diego Rivera, pardon me, if he did, but no, wait a minute. What's her name? Yes, he did. he did that thing with a big basket full of, that's Diego Rivera, right? And the woman, okay, he did calla lilies. I guess that, yes. Maybe, I'm doing the best I can with that. I still don't see an affinity between O'Keeffe and the social protest artists.
I just didn't see that as.
Yeah, if the calla lily, I don't even think the calla lily is a link because so many of the other ones did them, that they could be, the male genitalia aside, they could simply be a flower.
Well, I just didn't see him as doing a social commentary when
Yeah.
he did the cover.
Do you think there's social commentary? I'm not being,
No,
I don't think there's social commentary in the calla lily.
No, and that's what
No.
I think you were leading that most of his paintings had some social symbolism behind
Yeah.
it, and on the calla lilies.
Yeah, well, certain flowers do, of course, carry connotations. I mean, obviously, the rose carries connotations of love, and the bleeding heart carries some connotation, and so forth. But I think painters who do still lives of single flowers, not the big basket of flowers and the woman kneeling and so forth, might be another thing. I think they're pictures of flowers. Yes?
Do you see a relationship between her early close-up imagery and that of Paul Strand, the photographer, his early work?
Well, you people are tough. I suppose, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, she would be responding to Strand. Is that what you're saying? That she got the idea of doing those close-ups from Strand? Yeah. I mean, obviously Paul Strand was in her circle. She and Paul Strand were well acquainted. Paul Strand, for those of you who don't know, is an American photographer of the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s. I don't remember when he died, but and he was mostly an urban photographer. Is that fair? Was mostly urban.
He did an early series of close-ups, still-lifes of flowers and other forms.
Well, I think there's no question that the close-up, the intimate close-up, is very much part and parcel with O'Keeffe's work. You can't do that with a building, obviously. I mean, the Shelton with spots or the Radiator building or something. I mean, you can't really get up close and personal with a building. But almost everything else that she did, she zoomed in tight on the skulls and the clams and those things like that. So you really can't appreciate O'Keeffe at all. You can't leave out the intimate, in tight focus nature of her work and talk about O'Keeffe. That's part and parcel of the aesthetic. And by the way, I think it's very much part of the appeal. I mean, if you can imagine a picture like this done with a picture kind of a little flower, just this high, and it wouldn't have had the power. So, yes.
Could you just analyze yourself a little bit, as explaining your interest in art and dairy farming in Vermont? How does that
They don't go together?
Well, obviously they do for you. I'm just kind of curious how you analyze yourself in this regard. Or describe it.
Yeah. When I joined what was then known as Park Burnett, which became later Sotheby Park Burnett, I was not even out of college yet, and I got lucky, and somebody said to me they need help in the painting department, and so I ran in there to see what needed to be done, and they probably needed somebody to go get the coffee or something like that. But I hung around there, and it became clear in no time at all that nobody wanted to have anything to do with American paintings. So at that time, paintings meant old masters, which meant pictures painted sort of before 1800 and all the way back. And then there was 19th century pictures, and then there was, which meant 19th European traditional representational paintings. And then there was Impressionism, we all know what that is. And then there was a thing called Contemporary and Modern, which in 1967 didn't mean much because there wasn't much commerce in those things. They were barely dry. But American Pictures used to just kind of collect around the sides, and nobody really wanted to deal with them. And so I said, I'll do them. And so I got into doing American paintings. And my learning curve was very steep, and I had a lot to learn. And the nice thing about being head of the painting department in American is that every American painting painted between, say, 1720 and 1945, it was mine. And that meant whether it was painted in California or Chicago or Texas or New York or Boston, and those are all different cultural schools. And so you need to learn them all, because somebody's going to call you up and say, I've got a picture by so-and-so, and you need to say, oh yeah, well, I know all about that, or I don't know a thing about that. And so I probably sold in those days, I don't know, 1,500 paintings a year, and I probably saw 5 times more than that. And in those days, people would just pull up in their car, literally outside the door, and say to the doorman, I've got American paintings, and he would get on the phone and call me. And I would come down on the sidewalk and set the pictures against his car and say, I'm sorry, this is really nothing, and so on and so forth, unless it was something, which was, 1 in 100 or something. It was great fun to look, and you learn to meet the people and so forth. Now, why my wife and I decided to drop all that and move to Vermont is something we ask ourselves. We both, for one reason or another, decided we didn't want to live in the city anymore. And there's a certain pressure, a lot of pressure, actually, to be in the art world. And we wanted to move to Vermont and run a dairy farm where there was no pressure. And that took us a while to realize that dairy farming was highly complex. And once again, we didn't know a single thing about it, but we learned. And so then now I do both. And it's sort of like having 2 heads. I mean, I just sort of take this one and put it over there, and then I put the other one on, and you come up with a whole different range of things to think about and do. Yes?
So who built this evening?
I'm sorry, what?
Who built this evening?
Oh, no, the farm burned down in 95 or 6, whenever it was, and that put a stop to that. So there's no milking. And dairy farming, as I'm sure everybody knows, is a very, very grueling proposition, and it's stacked against the dairy farmer in a very serious way, and nobody has thought of anything to do to help Vermont keep its dairy farmers other than pay them more and more money. So it's not working very well. Yes?
Adding to my own question and answer, it strikes me that the art is full of interpretation as well as aesthetics. Farming is very grounding, literally, so it kind of helps you stay in the real world while you're wandering into, feel safe wandering into your imagination.
These days, I sell pictures. People call up and they say, I have this, I hear you're in the art business and I have such and such. And if it's something that I think I can do, I help them sell it. I'll take it to New York and give it to a dealer down there who I know. And it's nice. I like keeping my hand in. I spend more time, I think, trying to get Vermont to change its agricultural policies, but I have virtually no success doing that after 10 years of work. Vermont does not want to change its agricultural policies. And I'm sure you know that the lake is polluted and a few other things, so something has to change, but we're not making any progress on that. So one more, and then I'll let you all go. Yes?
Have you ever attempted to paint yourself? Take up painting yourself?
Painting, I do. Oh, I wouldn't ever show them to anybody, really. I mean, unfortunately, I know what a good painting looks like. What I don't know is what it takes to make one. It's very, very hard work. And I like to do it when I go on vacation. I'll set up in front of a little vase of flowers, or maybe the dishes that are left on the table or something like that, and try to capture those. And I have a couple of things that are kind of successful, but I have a tendency to be way too tight. You know, I mean, I think the great thing for a painter is to be like Matisse, is to be able to just go, and you've done a nude. You know, I can't do that. I can't do that. Every line has to be just right. I do watercolors. That's pathetic. Thank you very much for coming.